the genie is out of the bottle. China is rapidly building a domestic AI industry. Thinking more philosophically, if real artificial general intelligence exists, it's worth almost any amount of money to achieve it. So really, I think the focus should be on building bridges, not walls.
Welcome to the Leader's Edge podcast. I'm Zach Ewell, podcast producer here at Leader's Edge. Last January, the AI industry and stock market were both blindsided. Nearly $1 trillion in value had been wiped off the NASDAQ 100. U.S. tech companies that had confidently invested billions of dollars in AI were now being threatened by new competition. The Chinese AI startup known as DeepSeek had launched. Supposedly only costing $6 million to develop, and as intelligent as OpenAI's reasoning models, the open source application surged to become the most downloaded free app for iPhone when released. For Brandon Nuttall, this was a Sputnik moment for the AI industry. Chief Digital and AI Officer at Xceedance, a global insurance services and consulting firm, I spoke with Nuttall to discover what new risks DeepSeek would bring to the AI and insurance market. DeepSeek had already made a large impression on the American stock exchange. So what would come next? Brandon, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Zach.
So I'm going to get down to my first question. As the US and China continue to butt heads in the global marketplace, what safety and security concerns are top of mind for people and businesses as DeepSeek, which is a new company on people's radars, becomes a more dominant player in the AI model sphere? Does this primarily have to do with where data is stored?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think DeepSeek is kind of the second Sputnik moment that we've had in AI. And I think where the data is stored is only a very small part of it, right? This is really the first major breakthrough in big foundational models, which has come from a Chinese AI lab. And, the openness with which the model has been published, I can talk a little bit more about that in a bit. It will lead to improvements for all AI usage in our industry. And really, I think the other important thing to touch on is I believe this will really spark a cost revolution, and it will unlock strong AI for individuals and institutions. So to answer your question specifically, DeepSeek is a model which has been released under a very permissive license. So DeepSeek hosts their own model, which of course is in China. So if you use that DeepSeek model that they host, then you're sending your data to China, just like if you use ChatGPT, you send your data to OpenAI. Now, the important thing to realize is because the model has been licensed so permissively, many, many people have downloaded this model and are hosting it in a variety of geographies. And I think for the first time, this is unlocking the ability for institutions of a smaller scale, like a hospital system or a university or even an insurance company, to be able to host this model themselves, in which circumstance the data doesn't leave your environment, right? And you have full control.
And then, jumping more into the insurance space, what policies and risks does DeepSeek impact for the insurance sector specifically?
So it depends on how you use it, right? So fundamentally, if you go to Microsoft Azure or another cloud model provider, you can access DeepSeek just as you could access, other OpenAI models or other third-party models entirely, right? So, typically the data security and the policies that you need to be thinking about are actually what are being enforced by your model provider, right? Now, there are then questions about model bias and the model training set, right? And actually, none of the big foundational model providers, even OpenAI, are entirely transparent about, how the underlying models were actually trained. In fact, I think there's a lawsuit that's just been filed against Meta because there's evidence that they illegally downloaded something like 80 terabytes of novels to use to train their models. And that is an allegation. It hasn't been proved true, but the fact of the matter is that all these organizations are very, very data hungry. Mm-hmm. So really, my advice to organizations would be understand what kind of problem you're trying to solve first, and then understand how you can access these models in a safe and compliant way.
When it comes to specific coverages, are we talking about, or risks? Like, would it be, cyber, or, directors and officers, or maybe errors and emissions? I mean, this seems like it touches all kinds of policies.
Yeah, I mean, when we think specifically about how you would protect yourself from risks, right? So, all generative AI models have specific risks linked to hallucination,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, where you are providing a service, right? And if that generative AI model hallucinates or doesn't do exactly what you want it to do, and you deliver that service, right? Depending on the jurisdiction, you could have liability.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think that these risks are still in the process of being understood
Mm-hmm.
as these things actually get operationalized and rolled out to the rest of the market. So, I'm not in a position where I could give advice, but it's definitely something that, chief risk officers need to be on top of as these things are being rolled out.
Is there any examples, I guess, that you could give for our listeners? And it doesn't have to be DeepSeek. It could just be, these large AI models in general. You talked about hallucinations. So, like, essentially, like an employee utilizing information from a AI chatbot and basically using that hallucination, that false fact in their day-to-day lives. That's kind of like a hardcore example, right? Like that kind of opens up the organization to liability.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. So even ChatGPT, if you go on, you can actually see what the knowledge cutoff is, right? And I think the knowledge cutoff now is somewhere inside of like the middle of 2024, right? So it just doesn't know about any events which have happened after 2024. So, but the thing is, if you're just a user of this, if you don't have a deep understanding as to how these models actually work behind the scenes, behind the curtain, you may ask it something about a more current event, or it would need to integrate some information which was not available until recently. And, the models are not very good at saying, I don't know. The models can sometimes create plausible information that just is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So realistically, the hallucination risk is real. Now, I think for industry leaders, the new generation of reasoning models, I think, is very, very interesting. So hallucinations happen because essentially the older generations of models, they don't think, they don't reason. The newer generation of models, and in particular, I'm thinking about the DeepSeek R1, which has got everybody excited, but also the OpenAI O1 family of models, and O3 works the same way. When it tries to answer a question, it tries to triangulate the answer to that question coming from multiple directions. And because it essentially uses different methods to solve the same question, it's actually less liable for hallucination. Now it's and that's one of the big changes which has happened, particularly over the last few months, is people are realizing, how compelling these reasoning capabilities really are, not because they give better answers to questions, but also because they can have the effect of reducing model hallucination.
So, how is this model then able to be developed with such little funding and time? That, you talked about the Sputnik moment at the beginning. The company says it was able to develop the model for only $6 million, which equates to just like 3% of total costs allocated to developing OpenAI's O1 reasoning model. Supposedly, DeepSeek's products are powered by even less advanced NVIDIA chips as well.
Yeah, I think necessity is the mother of invention, right? And if you take a look at what DeepSeek actually has done, and actually because the model is very, very open, anybody can inspect the code if they wish to. And the developers, the engineers who built DeepSeek, because they did not have access to the hardware that the Western AI labs did, they had to make some very specific low-level optimizations for their hardware. And the result of that is that they were able to achieve, in certain parts of the model, a 95% speed up. Now, because the research that they did is so open and the code is available, actually, these improvements are not just private to DeepSeek. these movements, these changes are actually something that all Western AI labs can incorporate. And I think because the Western AI labs have been so well funded, they may not have felt the same pressure to optimize their underlying technology. But the DeepSeek team did, and so they did. I think the other interesting thing here is, and I'm not a political scientist, but if you look at the geopolitics, this is quite interesting. So I like to listen to Sarah Payne, who is a professor at the U.S. Naval War College, and she's got a saying that I like. It says that the U.S., the West, has a tendency to play half-court tennis, has a tendency to make decisions and assume that the rest of the world won't respond. And so, an example, the access to NVIDIA chips has been highly restricted to China. However, it seems to have been highly restricted to China, not understanding that the chips are made in Taiwan and distributed to the globe through Singapore and Malaysia. So realistically, the chips are essentially at China's border, and
Sure.
so the same networks which exist to smuggle other things can smuggle graphics cards, and as opposed to other things you might want to smuggle, you could buy and sell these on the open market. So realistically, the genie is out of the bottle. China is rapidly building a domestic AI industry, and thinking more philosophically, if real artificial general intelligence exists, it's worth almost any amount of money to achieve it. So really, I think the focus should be on building walls, not bridges, or building bridges, not walls.
Yeah, and I mean, just to like think about it, like with U.S. geography, I mean, I guess imagine Puerto Rico was the #1 manufacturer of of chips in the world, and the U.S. would be able to get its hands on it pretty easily if it's right there. Something that you spoke about several times, actually, that I wanted to dive a little bit more into. But how does DeepSeek's free to use and open source impact its user growth? It seems to be that's a big selling point for using the application.
Absolutely. So when I think about institutions, and I think about a lot of my clients and some of their hesitance for using AI, right? It's about, do they have control of their data as it gets sent over the wire to the cloud, right? Which is where a lot of these models have been hosted. So the openness of DeepSeek and the freeness of the license which DeepSeek has been licensed under, and the efficiency of DeepSeek basically means that institutional strong AI is in reach. So what I mean by that is you can go to your server provider of choice and you can buy a server to run in your data center for less than $50,000, which can run DeepSeek in your own DC. So we're not talking investments in the millions. We're not talking investments in the hundreds of thousands. We're talking investments in the tens of thousands for you to have access to this capability entirely within your own data center. And so that openness and then the ability to tweak and tune the model to your needs really unlocks a huge number of use cases and unlocks a huge number of organizations who would previously be hesitant to use any AI are now seeing DeepSeek as a potential direction of travel forward for their AI ambition.
So DeepSeek was supposedly created through its reliance on reinforcement learning. Meanwhile, ChatGPT utilizes multiple machine learning techniques such as supervised and unsupervised learning to create output. Is this perhaps why DeepSeek supposedly relies on less energy to function? That seems to be another big reason why people are impressed and scared of it.
So I think you touched on something really important, right? So reinforcement learning for models like this, it's a technique that we always knew worked, right? So if you take a look at AlphaGo, so AlphaGo was, of course, the Go algorithm that was able to beat the world champion Lee Sedol at Go about 6 or 7 years ago. There was then another version of AlphaGo called AlphaZero, which basically, without knowing any of the rules of the game, trained itself from first principles using reinforcement learning.
Got it.
So we knew that reinforcement learning was a thing that could work, but nobody had figured out how to make reinforcement learning work for a reasoning language model in this way. So when when you read the DeepSeek paper and that 6 million figure that gets bandied about, that's essentially the number that they quoted that they spent doing the reinforcement learning step for basically teaching it how to reason. So that's one of the big breakthroughs, which is, to a certain extent, reinforcement learning can be very valuable with teaching a language model how to execute chain of thought reasoning. And that was really the reinforcement learning breakthrough that the DeepSeek team achieved.
And for our listeners too, would you be able to like just describe reinforcement learning?
Yeah, so it's relatively simple. So let's imagine that you have a random game. Let's imagine you have tic-tac-toe, right? And so what you do is you play a game, and let's say the AI is playing X and the AI is playing O, and you get to the end of the game and X is win, O is win, or it's a draw, right? So that is the condition, the rules of the game, and the result. So then what you do is the machine doesn't know the rules of the game. So then you run a second trial, but you feed into the model the results of the first, right? And then it plays the game again. And then you feed that back into the model, plays the game again. And so essentially with reinforcement learning, you use that kind of reinforcement cycle where you basically, you don't care how the model gets to the end, but you give it a reward at the end. And it's the reward at the end, that's the reinforcement that the machine uses to determine the rules of the game as the middle steps. So that's a very simplified example, but you can imagine this is a technique that's worked very well in kind of other closed domains like Go and like chess. But it's actually something that, the interesting result is it also works with understanding chain of thought reasoning, which is one of the really, really big results.
It's fascinating with this innovation with DeepSeek, with energy being such a hot button issue for China itself. I remember a couple years back, China used to be a huge supplier of energy for, cryptocurrencies, mining cryptocurrencies. And then they kind of cracked down on specifically Bitcoin mining and utilizing their energy for that. And with that context, it kind of makes sense essentially that, a company like DeepSeek that has reinforcement learning and which focuses more on working with what you have instead of relying so much on energy.
Yeah, so the energy aspect is fascinating. So Meta is building currently a data center about a quarter the size of Manhattan. Elon Musk and his XAI team run as far as we know, the biggest AI data center in the world in Louisiana, which has 200,000 chips in it, and it's actually used so much power that they're building their own natural gas power plant right next to the data center to be able to run it. Microsoft is restarting one of the nuclear reactors, which was stopped at 3 Mile Island, simply because they want to build a data center and they want to use that energy, right? So from an AI perspective, there's something called the scaling laws. And this is proven true from GPT-2 all the way through GPT-4, which is, the bigger the model is, the more you invest in it, the better the performance is. And that's pretty much a linear relationship. So essentially the next generation of data centers for building AI, they're being sized not for 100,000 chips, not for 200,000 chips, but for 1 million chips. And those will be using gigawatts of energy, right? So realistically, energy has always been important for running big data centers, but these capabilities are particularly energy hungry. And of course, you could see how energy security and being able to access energy, being able to hook up to the grid quickly, is going to be really, really important for where these data centers are placed and how well they run.
And it's also interesting because, we when it comes to politics and administrations, you have the pendulum that swings left and right. It's swinging right now. But, the previous administration and prior to that, there was a lot of concern around ESG and essentially companies, utilizing, and I'm using cryptocurrency as an example, but there's a lot of similarities between the usage of cryptocurrency and AI in how much energy is being used. To mine Bitcoin, those giant, it's the same thing. There's a lot of data centers that are just giant. And that uses up a lot of power, and so does AI. So I do wonder, do you think with this Sputnik moment, but also with this thought of, hey, it doesn't actually cost as much power to generate a efficient AI agent, do you think U.S. companies will kind of maybe backtrack or change their trajectory?
That's a really good question. I guess I'll go back to I'll mildly paraphrase a quote from Sam Altman. So he was asked a question on a panel he was on. If AI can make a programmer 10 times more effective, does that mean we need 1/10 the programmers? And his response was, we don't need 1/10 the programmers, what we need is 10 times the code. And I think what we'll find is something very, very similar happening in Western AI labs. If they can use DeepSeek's capability to achieve similar results at 1/20th the power, I think you'll find them using 20 times the power and getting results that are 20 times better potentially than what they could achieve before.
That makes total sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And realistically, I think this is linked to, the amount of potential economic benefit that these tools could deliver to the world if they could be made to work at scale. I believe these organizations feel that it's worth the power investment, it's worth the time investment, it's worth buying the chips to be able to achieve that growth. The second thing worth noting is that there's been a big push toward agentic AI. So essentially, AI agents that don't just do one or a few steps of the process, but AI agents who know enough about the broader business context to essentially work autonomously.
Sure.
So right now, when I'm talking to my clients, I talk to my clients a lot about, human machine teaming, right? Where the machine is subordinate to the human and the machine is basically there to assist the human, whether that's through, a knowledge agent or a chat capability or, in the previous case, pair programming, like a programmer capability. So that's the current. But I think as we go forward, we're going to move into a world where, our people that we have using human intelligence in our organizations are going to be orchestrating teams of agents who are doing the actual work on the ground, and they'll essentially be managing the agents. And I think if you look at the way an insurance company or a broker or an MGA is structured, it's very common for an underwriter to be supported with a nearshore and offshore underwriting ops team, right? Which does, a little bit of the quote unquote grunt work. They push the papers around and they basically present essentially data products to the underwriter for them to be able to push the process forward. So I think a lot of those roles are going to change, and a lot of those are going to be much more agentic than they are currently. So really, the low-hanging fruit is there. If we can find ways to make it so that the insurance products that we create are more easy to deliver to the right person, the right place, at the right time, we can do a better job of insuring the world. And I firmly believe that the way that we do that is by, leveraging tools like generative intelligence, leveraging digital transformation, and putting our people and putting our organizations into a place where that we can take our products and make them more available, more accessible to more people.
That was my interview with Brandon Nuttall. I hope you enjoyed it. For more podcasts, go to leadersedge.com.